Good afternoon, everyone. As we transition to the start of our lecture this afternoon, just want to hold for a couple of seconds to let everyone into our session. We'll get started in just a moment. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Blair, the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at DeSales University. And on behalf of the Office of DEI, along with our partnership today with the Alumni Office at DeSales as part of our homecoming week here, I welcome you to our Indigenous Peoples Day keynote and lecture this afternoon. Before we start, I'd like to ask everyone in attendance virtually this afternoon if we could just hold space for a moment of quiet self-reflection or prayer before we get started. Thank you, everyone. And as mentioned, we are here to discuss Indigenous Peoples Day and just wanted to provide a little bit of context before I introduce our guest this afternoon. And again, want to welcome all of our students, our faculty, staff, alumni, and community partners that are with us here this afternoon. Indigenous Peoples Day is a holiday that celebrates and honors Native American peoples and commemorates their histories and cultures. And I want to hold there by acknowledging here in the Lehigh Valley and at DeSales University that we acknowledge with respect the people of the Lenni Lenape, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands DeSales University now stands. We honor them and their lands and their many contributions to the world around us, including the original philosophies and practices of environmental stewardship. Respecting the call of Pope Francis and Laudato Si', we strive to show special care for indigenous communities and their cultural traditions. The celebrating of Indigenous Peoples Day took root at an international conference on discrimination sponsored by the United Nations in 1977. And since then, South Dakota was the first state to recognize the day in 1989, and the cities of Berkeley and Santa Cruz, California soon followed. In 1990, the International Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Populations in the Americas, again sponsored by the United Nations, began to discuss and really kind of sat in the middle of the difficult conversations with respect to Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's in that space in which we have our discussion today. And I encourage all of us to come together with open hearts and open mind, to be a part of this discussion and to listen to the message that we're going to hear from a friend and colleague of mine that I'm really excited to introduce in just a moment. And that would be Hugh Burnham, who's of the Mohawk Nation, the Wolf Clan. And he is completing his doctoral work currently in the Cultural Foundations of Education program at Syracuse University, and is an assistant professor of humanities at Medaille College, which is in Buffalo, New York. His research interests include social justice and education, community engagement efforts, language revitalization, environmental advocacy, and indigenous gender work as well. Hugh's dissertation explores indigenous student experiences in higher education, nation building, and indigenous masculinity. So it's with that I ask everyone to again give a virtual welcome to Hugh. And as he shares his keynote for us this afternoon, I want to be mindful, excuse me, that any questions you may have, you can of course direct them to us via the Q&A feature. And we will hold a little bit of time at the end of our discussion today to answer any of those questions that might be on your mind and spirits this afternoon. Bill Hoagland, thank you for the note in the chat. Fantastic. And with that, Hugh, again, welcome, and I'll pass the virtual microphone over to you.
Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. And I really appreciate everybody's time today on Indigenous Peoples Day, what we now understand to be Indigenous Peoples Day, what may have changed since we were last couple generations here, which we may have known as Columbus Day, or even some universities, colleges refer to as fall break, to many different versions of referring to fall break. It's really, geez, a friend of mine once said to me, when I was going through some of my own experiences in college, and she was kind of wrestling with some of the same stuff as a Native woman, Mohawk woman. And we noticed that it became really difficult for us to sort of navigate the fall semester. In the fall semester, you might know that it's, sort of a line of experiences that we have in like 3 months or so. We're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, which some people call Fall Break, Columbus Day. And then it's, soon after that is Halloween, which we deal a lot with cultural appropriation issues, right? And conversations about that. And then later, with Thanksgiving, it's also a difficult time for us to kind of reflect on what Indigenous identity means. So, I'm hoping to, or I guess we're hoping to have a conversation about what that means, within the broader context of our society and within the universities and colleges that we occupy as well. I think, just considering, I guess I'll introduce myself real quick. Before I start talking. My English name is Hugh Burnham. My real name is Hode'hnyahä. And that means that he has a stick on his shoulder, literally breaks down to the stick on his shoulder rises along. And I'm Untitled Mohawk Wolf Clan. And I grew up in the Onondaga Nation and near the Tuscarora Nation as a kid. And then eventually I went on to college and I, received, I think my bachelor's degree from Buffalo State College, master's degree from Buffalo State College, and then my soon to be Ph.D. from Syracuse University, where I spent a number of years, I think since 2013. They don't really tell you how long PhDs take until you actually experiencing it. So just a quick note for everybody. I've been really proud to, discuss some of these things throughout the past. I've been in a number of Scott's, sort of things that he's welcomed me to with open arms, always a warm welcome. So I really appreciate the time and the space for this. And of course, we might be scrolling through our news feed right now on social media, various social media platforms, kind of scrolling down and we're seeing small discussions about what Indigenous Peoples Day is or means, or even maybe some folks who are really against Indigenous Peoples Day who might assert that, it's Columbus Day really is what we're celebrating because, maybe people have Italian heritage or they understand history in a different way. And so, it is difficult for us to sort of navigate that space, I'm sure, especially considering that when in my community, we associate Columbus Day with cultural genocide or physical genocide of Indigenous peoples. And it's really difficult to kind of come to grips with that. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that first and foremost, making sure that we're paying specific attention to the meaning of the day and what that could mean for many people. I come from a family that I've, is my family. We have really, Scott and I were talking before the call about the complexities of Indigenous identity. I grew up in a family where my religion would be the Longhouse religion, spirituality of the Hode'hnyahä people, which is the traditional sort of spirituality. But also I grew up with family members, my father's side who grew up Catholic. And so, obviously sometimes conversations at the dinner table were not always as easy as we all, might think they should be. And I think that a lot of us probably experience the same thing. But it speaks to the complexities and the nuances that we all celebrate on this day. And I think that's what it's about. It's about celebration of survival, despite the atrocities and the dark history of settler colonialism in the Americas and across the world too. Let's make that known. So, I kind of wanted to come in here, maybe a little bit of, I guess I'm flowing between different topics. And I guess what I'll speak to, first and foremost, probably is the idea of Columbus, maybe some quotes from Columbus that might be helpful, as well as the Doctrine of Discovery. I don't know if many folks have really looked into the Doctrine of Discovery and what that meant as far as a global settler colonial project. But I think that it's worth spending some time on just to discuss that. And then, I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit about what we might refer to as settler myth. This concept of settler myth, how we might say that, well, indigenous peoples aren't here anymore, they're gone. That's a settler myth. Another settler myth is maybe that indigenous peoples are, they live in teepees, right? That's another settler myth. And so, you know, even kind of breaking it down to the in Halloween, how we dress in these costumes that refer to indigenous peoples with feathers and all this, you know, sort of culturally inappropriate ways, which perpetuates the settler myth. Certain things that we do that we might not always be aware of, and that also, you know, in recognition of folks who might not be always on the same page and say, no, that doesn't perpetuate settler myth. Not only, I think it is appropriate to, you know, ask them, you know, follow-up questions, but also to welcome in, you know, and to say, hey, let's have a conversation because it's really important. And of course, many of us are probably dealing with that on a regular basis. You know, my supervisor just sent me a quick, I have multiple hats. I'm a consultant on my site, one of my side hustles. So I look down and she sends me this picture of like a Thanksgiving, it's Canadian Thanksgiving right now. It's like a Thanksgiving sort of celebration, right? With pilgrims and Indians, like a cartoon, you know, characters and everything. And she goes, how do I respond to this? And I was just like, oh, that's a good one, right? And it's somebody who is a parent who they're both lacrosse parents, and somebody who's reaching out, right? Kind of saying like, we think, you know, in all well-meaning, you know, hey, just let you know, this is, you know, a good whatever celebration, Thanksgiving, and you're a Native person, so I want to send you this really sort of inappropriate message. But so she responded with, well, I'm going to have a conversation with her today. So we're always taking time out of our days to discuss that with people, even though it's really difficult for some of us to discuss, and we do have to bear that weight. I do often, you know, thank you, Deborah. I do often really wrestle with at times when it is appropriate or not to have that conversation. And there is an appropriate time and there is not an appropriate time sometimes. And that's for all of us to navigate. Okay, so really appreciate the time again. I'm gonna click over here. I put some notes on the side just for my own, just for myself. So when we talk about the doctrine of discovery, I usually ask my students in my classes, what does this mean? Have you ever heard of the doctrine of discovery? To which most of my students, if not all of my students in the class, always kind of look at me with puzzled looks and really don't know what I'm talking about. And you know, this is the moment where I ask you all, and if it'd be appropriate for this space, have you ever heard of the doctrine of discovery? That's my question to you all. Have you ever heard of the doctrine of discovery without Googling? That is, just off the top of your heads. And while we sort of wait for some of your responses in the chat box, a quick Y or N, and this is maybe the time where we, you know, use this as a sort of entry point. The entry point, I think, is really, you know, crucial, and to do it justice, it'd be really, you know, to our benefit in this space. So we have 2 no's, 3 no's, 4 no's, 5 no's. It's pretty common to not know what that is, and that's okay, because quite frankly, our education system does not do the job that we sometimes feel it should around these topic areas. Okay, so in 1452, a papal bull from Pope Nicholas V bestowed what he called special graces to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. And so that was a global call prior to the sort of what we might think about as the discovery. I'm going to put that in scare quotes right now, the discovery of the New World, they called it. And this initiative is what we now call the Doctrine of Discovery, or, you know, I want to say again, the special graces to subjugate indigenous lands and indigenous peoples throughout the entire world. And of course, we know in 1492, we had Columbus, you know, the old rhyme, which also is a settler myth that perpetuates the erasure of indigenous peoples. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, okay, in that whole poem about Columbus discovering Americas. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI introduced the Inter Cetera, which validated Christian conquest over non-Christians all over the entire world, including the New World, classifying indigenous peoples among the flora and fauna, later as subhuman, and labeling indigenous intellect as savage or barbarous. And I wanted to, quick note to what Columbus wrote in his diaries, just upon, his discovery, I guess maybe his personal discovery. I guess we were discovering in, Europeans too at the time. So it was kind of like a dual discovery. And we can go into a little bit of the language that we use as indigenous people to refer to what we first see as Europeans. Columbus wrote in his diaries about his encounters with indigenous peoples, specifically the Taino people, that they were good and intelligent servants who would, quote, become Christians very easily, for it deemed to me that they had no religion, unquote. And he referred to the indigenous men as lazy. There were no sailing ships, no wheeled vehicles, stone arches, churches, iron tools, steel weapons or guns, and also that Native women were drudges, right? And so we can later describe some of the ways that Europeans, we call it the European gaze or the white gaze, G-A-Z-E, the ways that Europeans had, first seen us, first gazed upon us. Now, let's not forget, one thing that I wanted to be really clear about. At this point in time, we have, a lot of things going on in Europe, right? We had the Protestant Reformation kind of happening, and sort of people, eventually would come a little critical of the church once indigenous peoples were sort of, discovered by the Europeans. That's when, again, in their world, right? We're not saying discovered as in like, oh, look, they were, no. What we're saying is that when indigenous peoples are seen by Europeans, it's kind of caused this sort of thought process. And there are many philosophers who really discuss this that would later affect us in what we would eventually call the Western world. And so, the way that we describe this is sort of like what is human nature? And so there's this big conversation in Europe about what is human nature, and they're looking like, okay, we have, sort of a caste system, we have a kingdom, right? But in the Americas, or what later would become the Americas, we see, the wild, barbarous cannibals that are on the other side of the water, and they're monsters, right? That's what they referred to indigenous people as monsters. But what better way to justify the taking over of lands? And so when we talk about the Doctrine of Discovery, though that land that was discovered, right, quote unquote discovered, was sort of, there were like sort of these ways to describe, right, how you see and what you see, and then report it back to the Catholic Church. And at the time, the Catholic Church was sort of the do all, be all. That's the word, and that's it. When folks brought back the idea, Christopher Columbus being one of them, right? All these folks coming back and forth with the transatlantic slave trade, the sugars and the spices, right? Eventually, and the silver and the gold that they found in South America, the mountain of silver. All this kind of was happening. They needed a way to justify the taking over of those lands, and so the Pope in the Doctrine of Discovery had suggested that if you don't see anybody basically who is Christian faith, they are then a barbarian, they are a savage, and this isn't the first time that we use this language. I think that language was also used with folks in Ireland, right, with the Irish. And so when the Pope had said this, it really suggested that if there were no people who celebrated, who are part of Christianity, they were essentially a part of the land. They were wild. They were, lower than actually humans. And so you're discovering that land in the name of God. And so that means that that land can then be taken over in the name of God for the Catholic Church, for the land wherever you come from, right? And so that's what kind of spawned the English and the French and the Spanish and Portugal sort of coming over, right? And all these, thank you, De las Casas, yes. And I actually do want to point to that too, Scott. In the depiction, and I have a couple articles that might be helpful. Again, I believe De las Casas was a priest. Is that correct? And he was sort of witnessing, sort of the onslaught of, these people, right? And we see, it through his words that, women, children, elderly, babies are murdered by the thousands, right, during this process. So, that's another thing that we can probably dig into that would be really helpful. Thank you for the citation. That would definitely point to that as well. So with the Doctrine of Discovery sort of in place, and eventually sort of what we see as like the Americas, coming to be, and the European gaze, the European perspective, and all this movement with the economy, right? Eventually, Spain's economy would inflate to crazy levels that they couldn't really, necessarily afford. None of these countries could afford the discovery that they're doing, right? The wars they're waging on the other side of the water. But eventually, what we come to is sort of this fight for land on the East Coast with what we call the 13 colonies that were under English rule.
Hugh, we just lost your audio a little bit. We just lost your audio a little bit. Check, mic check.
Oh, can you hear me?
There we go. We're back now.
Okay. How long was that out for? Okay.
Oh, only like 5 seconds. You're good.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened. Maybe I have my AirPods over here. I don't know. So, long story short, when we talk about the Doctrine of Discovery, it really was the underpinnings of what would eventually become the colonization of the Americas. We talk a lot about, Christopher Columbus not even making it up here to North America, and that's very much true. In fact, when he passed away, he literally thought he didn't understand that he didn't discover America. It was like, he thought he was, I don't know, somewhere else. And so I think for sort of stake claim, when we talk about South America or even Central America, that is really sort of dominated by the Christopher Columbus narrative, but that narrative also seeps into North America as well. And that's why, I think we're discussing it to the length that we are today, because we do believe in that myth, even though we know damn well that it's not, that it didn't happen here, right? And so we still kind of perpetuate that. So as an underpinning, to look at the Doctrine of Discovery. Okay, well, now if we really consider what the lasting impacts of the Doctrine of Discovery had on Indigenous peoples and all of us, in North America, we could definitely cite it, and we can cite it in legal doctrine today. And that's, I guess, probably the scary part, right? That when we look at the where Indigenous people fall within the federal eyes, right, of the United States, they fall in the Department of the Interior, which is the same department that holds the parks, right, and recreation, right? All these sort of, I don't know how you classify, when they classified, okay, well, let's put Native people in with the, the wild things that they are. And so it's been this way for since that, since the founding of what would eventually become the United States. And here's the thing: when we talk about Indian law, we say Indian law. That's sort of the way to discuss Indigenous law in North America, specifically the United States. We have folks that are still citing today, right? And there's a nation that's next to us, the Oneida Nation in New York State, and they fought for their land, and they fought very for a very long time, and it was dismissed in the federal court, Supreme Court, and it was dismissed based on this doctrine of this legislation of latches, meaning they took too long to asked for their land back. And so what that caused was, sort of an investigation into why, why is it, okay, we're taking too long. Okay, that's one justification. What's the other? Is there any other justification? And it turns out there was, and the justification was the Doctrine of Discovery. And so that's why another reason why the Unitas couldn't get their land back. And so that doctrine very much holds true today. All right, so another thing I wanted to kind of talk about, maybe some of the things that we're wrestling with a little bit today, with this concept of myth making. And what I wanted to go to was just common things that we heard, that we've always heard throughout our own lives. When we refer to the United States, often we'll hear it referred to as the New World. That term was first coined by Amerigo Vespucci in 1503. It really hasn't since moved much. We know what the New World means, right? Maybe eventually when Elon Musk and, whoever, all these billionaires are discovering other new worlds, they can apply it to that too. I mean, and I just wrote a paper of this sort of settler colonialism that we're experiencing today, which is subjugating us through our economy. The more that we shop on Amazon, the more that we contribute to these, unfathomably rich billionaires, what it's doing to us as smaller communities as well. And so, who is the we say neo-colonialism? How did that happen? Okay, so we see a term in the U.S. Constitution about Indigenous peoples. And the only way that Indigenous peoples are referred to in the U.S. Constitution is that they are merciless Indian savages. Again, 1787. Yeah, I mean, like, these are, we'll get to the founding fathers first, in a little bit too, which is something that we, consider in Hode'hnyahä communities. We are really matrilineal. We are, some people say matriarchal, and we are even matrifocal, I've heard. And the way that we have our own system of governance is through the female line. And so your leadership is really chosen by the clans, but that voice of your clans is said through the clan mothers of the community. And those clan mothers will then choose a leader, male leader, to, represent their clan. There we see, a different style of leadership. When we refer to the founding fathers, we really see this patriarchal view. So not only is it a racial dynamic, it's a gender dynamic. When we see the colonization of the Americas, men eventually were moved to the head of the household, where typically, traditionally, that wasn't the case. It was the females that ruled the head of the household. Even economy, right? Like, Indigenous women primarily were in control of a lot of the economy. A lot of it, I mean, literally the land. And so you had, Indigenous women controlling, all this economy, the corns, beans, squash, right? All the things that we had here, and that we used, even our medicine, right? It was all kind of through the female line. But then once we saw sort of the colonization of the Americas, we see a gender dynamic flip. And, eventually it became that, men make all the money and women, their places in the home. And so we very much wrestle with that today as a society, but also we go back again to the complexities of Indigenous identity. We see that even within our families, and something that we need to address. So we also hear this term, right? Land of the free and home of the brave. Francis Scott Key, 1814, right? The home of the brave, the land of the free. Again, settler myth making. This is something where we need to get people here. People need to come to the Americas so that they can be free from, tyrannical governments, free from whatever they're living in. And again, sort of, it's a call out. It's a way to, essentially immigrate people to the Americas. Another big one, Manifest Destiny, John O'Sullivan, 1845. Manifest Destiny, a lot of people don't realize, I guess we don't always put this together in our minds. I know I didn't. But Manifest Destiny really didn't start in the West. It started in the East. And the West, the sort of the Western frontier was here in the East. And it was really dangerous to some folks who were, the frontiersmen, the European, or the cowboy, or whatever, all these sort of ways that we discuss Europeans at the time. Sort of this Wild West, right? Looking at this, like, envisioning this Wild West. It's so scary here. It's so dangerous and wild. And the only way we can, defend ourselves is in this hero sort of story comes to mind, right? And it's, how do we do this in the name of America? How do we do this in the name of discovery, in the name of what is good versus what is evil, right? And we see that, in the depiction of Manifest Destiny, which really essentially to me is one of the first forms of propaganda. You see, this heavenly being with the Bible, pushing all these evil, terrible things to the West. And we see indigenous people in the foreground kind of running and hiding. And we see sort of, the animals running as well. So what does that mean? Again, we're putting the European sort of the Eurocentric perspective on everything. Charles Dickens in 1853 first coined the term the noble savage. And really what we're ramping up to is the noble savage is the savage that is kind of good, meaning they use their mind, but also still a savage, right? And so I even think we still do this today, to this day. Just recently I had, there was maybe like a couple of years ago, two Mohawk brothers went to a university, University of Colorado. I don't want to say the wrong university, but it was a university in Colorado. And they were looked at by one of the family members, a white woman who had seen them come in and late into their own, campus tour that they were registered for. And she noticed what they were wearing and what they looked like. And she called the police. And so still to this day, we have this sort of issue where we lump people in, Black and brown people, into this sort of, what their idea of bad, or of evil, or even of, mischievous or criminal, or whatever they want to lump this in, into. We see that kind of playing out today. But this is one of the first times that somebody had referred to in Charles Dickens the idea of the noble savage, somebody who is still very proud, whatever. And then we have now 15 years later, another concept come that would kind of really blanket statement many indigenous people for the next couple hundred years. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. And so we have, another narrative spring up that is, looking at the past, looking at the future, stating very blatantly that the only way that we're going to be able to live within our country is if we completely eradicate indigenous people, because they are not, they're not good to us alive. They're only good to us dead. And this is where I often like to sort of discuss, I don't know if people are familiar with the Mohawk haircut, the origins of the Mohawk haircut. I don't know if we ever talked about that. But sometimes I like to plug, Tom Porter Sagogoniungwas is one of our sort of knowledge holders in our community. And he talks a lot about the origins of the Mohawk haircut. And the origins of that haircut are really quite fascinating, and also very much like something we would definitely do. Again, looking at the European gaze, I'm going to hurry this up a little bit, but the European gaze, right? What's the first thing that we see when we talk about like Mohawk people, right? When we were first contacted by the French, seen by the French, what they had noticed of us was that we had these Mohawks, a sort of style of hair, and in the middle we have a path. So it's like a like let's just say like a sort of hair in the middle, like a strip, but we refer to it as a path. And the idea is that when we go to war with people, it's not something that is a good thing to us. It's something actually that is, something that we don't want to do. But we shaved our heads in that manner to sort of recall and to understand our own worldview. So we have in our religion, we have what we call the creator, and also we have somebody who is his brother, who we refer to as this sort of like mischievous being, like think Loki, right, of the West, of different mythology. So we have this mischievous being who kind of destroys everything that the creator builds, and even us as people. And so we recall when we have the Mohawk hairstyle, essentially his name is Flint, and he's one of our, one of our, most amazing sort of beings that we recall and that we, look at as very powerful. And so when we go to war, when we went to war, we had these Mohawks that were in the shape of how we viewed Flint, because he later would destroy his mother after, the twins were born, and all this sort of in our creation stories. And so the next part of that is, so the Europeans kind of see us with this, they refer to us as beasts, right, and all this stuff. And then, we decide to, after war is over, we're instructed to, from our community, to face the rising sun. And we look at the sun as our elder brother, and who's, the elder brother to us is sort of our leader, like a mentor. And he instructs us to, he loves, he's like sort of this warrior, but he knows sort of the concept of war is not a positive thing. So we are instructed to face the rising sun and shave off the strip on our heads, that would be the Mohawk, and let our hair grow long again, that would be in the resemblance of the creator. And so it kind of shows the sacredness of our hair, and the reason that many of us have long hair. My son had long hair for most of his childhood, and we see today that sometimes people call even teachers, right, folks who don't understand the culture, oh, your little girl over there, right? They'll say kind of things like this that are microaggressions, because we look at hair in such a sacred manner, and so it kind of complicates things for us. So again, kind of going back to the only good Indian is a dead Indian, right? Those concepts again. General Sheridan, 1869, was the first to coin that. Lewis Henry Pratt, who actually created the residential boarding schools, the concept of the residential boarding schools that would devastate our communities. He said that again in 1892. Again, think about that. That's what Indian education is. Essentially kill the Indian and save the man. And then Theodore Roosevelt in 1901, again, stated that very clearly. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. We see the Great American Melting Pot, sort of myth come along, right, in Zangwill in 1908, right, again, sort of promoting this idea that we are to assimilate with each other to become this new identity of the Americans. And so, that's, again, something that when we talk about Indigenous education, we talk about the problem of assimilation, cultural genocide, and that's what that perpetuates. Mary Anton in 1912 discusses the promised land, again, perpetuating this myth, settler myth that this is the land of opportunity, this is where you want to come, and again, sort of recruiting globally. The founding fathers, right, another sort of concept that we see, and I don't know if many of you understand this, but the founding fathers, sort of that, I don't know, we have that, what is it called, Mount Rushmore, right? In Mount Rushmore, we had the etchings of founding fathers and everything on that big mountainside. That used to actually be an sacred indigenous landmark that would refer to as the grandfathers. And so, it's very difficult to see a whitewashing of our history on the side of mountains, on the side of places, indigenous places that we are from. And so again, I will see my friends go there and literally flip off, what they see. And it's like very difficult for us as communities to kind of really wrestle with these concepts, because these are things that we grew up with. Okay, later, or around the same time, turn of the century there in 1904, we see a discussion about the vanishing race, or the vanishing Indian. Vanishing Indian, if you're ever curious, look up Edward Curtis. Took pictures of Native people because he believed that they were not going to be here anymore, and that was only just over 100 years ago. So it's really difficult for us to sort of understand what that means. And we see too, right, this issue of invisibility on college campuses. We see it everywhere, right, all throughout our society. What are Indigenous peoples in the United States, population-wise? Around 1% of the population. And, again, it is really difficult to see the history books referring to us in such a manner that would, kind of, I guess, make us believe that we would be vanishing, that we would be invisible. There's a really cool scholar, Brian Grayboy, who talks a lot about this issue of invisibility / visibility. And many Indigenous students who are on college campuses, maybe like your own, who are Indigenous, do feel this both invisibility and visibility. But invisible, when I say invisible, I mean, like, probably nobody knows that I'm Native on this campus. Probably no one says they met a Native person when maybe I talk to them every day. You know, nobody asks about my culture or where I'm from. In the meantime, though, the Indigenous student is also visible. When the Indigenous student becomes visible, it becomes a deficit-based framework. Oh, you know, you live in teepees. What do you guys do for Thanksgiving? Or what is, you know, again, like sort of this perspective that is like, oh, like you're relegating that person to the past as extinct. I didn't realize that Indigenous peoples were still here, right? You know, these sort of microaggressions that we might see. Also, you know, take that deficit-based framework that we referred to again as looking at Indigenous people as in the negative, right? As not as, you know, oh, you guys live in houses. I didn't know that. It's really difficult to navigate sort of the racial dynamics. You know, again, you know, you could be walking on campus and get pulled over by a police officer because you dress a certain way, or your skin's a certain color, and get questioned this way. Again, you know, you only become visible in the deficit-based manner. And that's Brian Brayboy. I highly suggest looking into that scholar. Our favorite one. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Marzolo, 1948, a poem that we all remember and that we all sort of regard as the truth, right? And in that poem, we understand that Columbus discovered America. And I think that, you know, again, you know, there's a lot of conversation about this that I really do think it needs to continue on. But as we understand it, we understand Indigenous Peoples Day to discuss Indigenous survival, to show that we are still here, that we are very much resilient to the settler colonial project, and even settler myth making. And so I do think that many of us, you know, even Indigenous people, sometimes fall within the scope, within this issue of settler myth making. And to open up that conversation, I think is courageous. It's really brave. And to just kind of, you know, insert, hey, look, I don't think that's true. You know, those are moments where you can actively say, you know, change somebody's mind about something, despite maybe some defensiveness up front. I think those are really important conversations. And again, I do want to say, I want to state this very clearly. In 2016 through 2020, we saw, again, another myth, more myth making, and it's the idea of make America great again. And, you know, I look back at this list that I created, and I wonder how great America really was. And, you know, I think too, like when we look at, you know, the true history, right? When I say true history from various perspectives, let's look at this from various perspectives. That's what we're wrestling with when it comes to Columbus and this idea of Indigenous Peoples Day sort of teetering. I do want to give a quick shout out to some of the folks in the Onondaga Nation who've done a good deal of work around advocating to take down the Columbus statue in the middle of Syracuse, the city of Syracuse, where I'm from. And you know, the amount of conversation that's gone into that. Still, we see a lot of resistance from the side of many Italian Americans, but we also see folks changing their minds, many Italian Americans as well. So I do think that, you know, the conversation needs to continue. I do want to make sure that we're cautioning the way we talk about Indigenous people so that we're not falling within this settler myth. And that's really, I think, what I wanted to discuss today. And I would be happy to field any questions if folks had some, and maybe we can go from there.
Thank you, Hugh. And I've actually received two questions directly to me here, but also want to hold space to honor the discussion again, as we discussed and as you've explored with us, and honoring the complexity of it. And for me, I know looking at some of the work of De La Casas in particular, you know, speaking of that and the identity he had, I believe, as a priest in the Caribbean at the time. And that's what you spoke to here. And the question that we have here, Hugh, also actually reference references the recent proclamation from the White House. So I'm going to read it really quick for our attendees. For generations, federal policies systemically sought to assimilate and displace Native people and eradicate Native cultures. That was the language, again, from the White House last week in honoring Indigenous Peoples Day. We recognize Indigenous peoples' resilience and strength, as well as the immeasurable positive impact that they have made on every aspect of American society. That's what President Biden shared last week. And with that, here's our question, which is, Hugh, can you speak to us a little bit about those immeasurable impacts, most notably the impact that the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, had with the founding fathers? I believe the question references Ben Franklin when it came to the Constitution and other documents.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, I'll make sure I'm not on mute. Sure. Yeah, that's definitely a great question. And I think, some of the sort of influence that we can see culturally between different, perspectives. The Haudenosaunee were influencers of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. This is something you can easily do. I mean, if you have a paper, let me see, a piece of $1 bill, a piece of paper. On the front, we call George Washington Hode'hnyahä, which means town destroyer in our language. And every US president is called town destroyer, regardless of their policies, even if we like their policies. We call them that because it's a name of the office. And George Washington literally destroyed our villages and towns during the Clinton-Sullivan campaign. But on the back of the US bill, you can see, if you look very closely, in the talon of the eagle, if you have a dollar bill, it might be better if you just pull that out and looked at it. I do this exercise with my students as well. You can see, on one hand, we have arrows, and the other hand, we have, sort of the olive branches. In the talon of the eagle, there are 13 arrows, and that references the 13 colonies. But the idea, the concept of arrows was one that came from the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, and we refer to ourselves as the Haudenosaunee. So during the when they were kind of thinking about the sort of the Constitution, right, and how they would plan to implement it, Benjamin Franklin most notably said that, look at, when they actually visited Onondaga in Syracuse, near Syracuse now. And what he said was that even a group of savages can create a government. Why can't we? And, again, he referred to us sitting on the ground, these savages are all around, whatever. Eventually, what our community and leadership told our founding fathers was that if you take an arrow by itself and snap it, right, it's not really that strong. If you take 5 arrows, meaning the arrows of the Haudenosaunee, meaning the fires, the communities of the Haudenosaunee, right, we talk about the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, Cayuga, and the Seneca, and later the Tuscarora, right, the 6 nations. Back then it was only 5. And when they were referring to the 5 nations, they would say, well, you need to unite all your nations together in order to create a strong union. And they took the arrows of 5 arrows together and they tried to break them, and they displayed, to those who were in attendance what that means. Well, later we see that imagery, and also in the writings of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, we also see sort of some of that discussion. We refer to our communities as fires, our nations as fires. A quadrille is how we say. And that means, we also say the same thing for families. So a fire is a family. So when this discussion was being had, we see in the writings of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson that they were discussed as fires, 13 colonies. We see the very clear sort of indication that Haudenosaunee did influence the US Constitution. I also think that too, right, you can look into Karl Marx, writings by Karl Marx. We influenced the writings of Karl Marx, and some eventually what would become different forms of government. In addition to that, most notably, Sally Roche Wagner does some work around Haudenosaunee women who were influential during the feminist movement. And we have a few different women who are, suffragists in their own right, actually be adopted into the Haudenosaunee as well during that, that time that they were fighting for that. We see that, we kind of revisit that, some of that history in her class, and she's really good at discussing it and, showing that history. So it's just some things that we were able to influence. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. And personally, I'm glad you pulled out the dollar bill. I remember the first time you and I had a conversation on this, you actually pulled out a dollar bill to share that. So I'm glad you were able to do that for our attendees this afternoon. And if you have a dollar bill, or go grab one tonight or later tomorrow, so you can see the imagery there. I think that's an important one. We have about 5 minutes left until we look to adjourn. So again, if anyone else has any other questions, please share them. I have one that has been submitted. It was the second one that I referenced earlier. And Hugh, I'm actually emotionally, I'm a little tight in reading this here on my heart. And I appreciate the individual who shared this, because this is a deep dive question, right? And it has to do with Orange Shirt Day, which I know is at the end of September. And the attendee just simply asked Hugh if you could provide some context for the significance of Orange Shirt Day, which is honored at the end of September.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I can pull up my notes, but I'll just tell you quick, kind of quick and simply what this might mean. The history of the Orange Shirt Day. I believe it was in the 1960s. A woman, I don't have her name off the top of my head, Indigenous woman who lived in Canada, picked out went to the store with her grandmother, and her grandmother had told her that, you're going to be going to school tomorrow, and we're here to get you some clothes so that you can wear and be proud of yourself, right? And it's going to be again, her grandmother is really, kind of bringing up her spirits. It's really exciting. And then she picks out this orange shirt from the classroom, or from the store, and she remarks on how orange it is, how bright. But again, she kind of refers it to her personality, right, who she is and everything. And so she's really excited to wear this orange shirt. Well, she would later, the next day, go to a residential boarding school in Canada. And on that very same day, the school administrators and the teachers took her, cut her hair, took a lot of the stuff that she brought with her away from her, including the orange shirt. And it's there that she was forced to never speak her language again, and nor her culture. And she survived through this ordeal that we now call the residential boarding schools, where she was abused, and she did go through a lot of problems as a child, and would later have to deal with that trauma on her own. The orange shirt that she was so proud of was taken away from her, and it symbolized so much. It symbolized survival. It symbolized our way of knowing and our way of being and thinking, and our language, right, our whole worldview. And when that was violently ripped away from her, what we see is sort of what's left, and we can only work with what we can do in our communities. We wear the orange shirts to remember what that struggle is about, to bring back the languages in our community, and to bring back the worldview that may have been lost or really threatened in the residential boarding schools. The residential boarding schools for many of us was a really dark time, and that we're still wrestling with today. And we see the lasting impacts of the historical trauma that our communities go through. We still see it, it's still there. For a lot of our community members, maybe it's our grandmothers never speaking to us in our own language again, maybe who may be a survivor. It could be the harshness that we go through, and maybe we even grow up in these households that are quite abusive from Indigenous people, who did attend residential schools. And so it's really difficult to sort of navigate when your whole identity is stripped from you as a child, and what it's like to grow up as an adult and raise children and family on your own. And so, that speaks to some of the issues around what the origins of the Orange Shirt Day. I encourage you to Google it, look it up, celebrate it with us. It's a celebration of resilience. It's also sort of a memorial in some ways. It's just a remembering. It is really difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, it is. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm appreciative of the questions that have been asked, and we have two more. And this one is a really good one. Thank you. I believe it's Joe who forwarded this one to us, which is, do most American Indigenous peoples have part European ancestry? If so, how could this affect their sense of identity? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that it is complicated. We can't really, I don't know if we can say that all Native peoples do, but we can certainly say that many do. I do. And we don't always wear it either. Like it's hard to say. But what I will say to this question is this: with the complex identity, with somebody who is maybe, part Irish and part Indigenous or whatever nation they might be from. Again, remembering that a lot of us, not all Indigenous people, but many Indigenous people identify through either their father or their mother. And that is traditionally too. So like my mother is Mohawk Wolf Clan, so therefore I am Mohawk Wolf Clan. My father doesn't matter, because in our culture, our fathers really don't matter in determining our identity. But it does get a little bit more complex. If my father was the one who was a Native Indigenous person, I wouldn't get his clan or anything in my community or his nation. So if he was the only one that was Indigenous, and my mother was non-Indigenous, she was white, say, for example, I would, in my community's eyes, be not Indigenous, right? And so we understand that, okay, that's a little bit of a hard line. And so we do have adoption policies in our own communities with regard to like self-determination, right? Like we can determine for ourselves who is a part of our community and not, based on certain criteria that we choose, and that's a federal law, right? Also want to note too that is the federal government can at any time take our federal recognition away, any Indigenous community. So if you have a group of people who say, have been, intermarrying for some period of time, that could be justifications as a claim to say you're not an Indigenous person anymore. And that's one of the fears of many Indigenous communities. That said, though, we can do some things in our own communities to rival that, and we can adopt, right? We can make sure that we're being, sensitive to the needs of our community members. But it is really difficult for many who don't feel a sense of belonging in their own community because of their racial identity or mixed race identity or whatever you may have. And the same thing is true too, right? Like, well, I don't want to veer too much away from the question. Here's the thing: we could probably say that many Indigenous people do. We can't really probably put a number to it. Do have European ancestry of some sort. I mean, I do. But we want to make sure that we're not looking at it only solely through a racial sort of paradigm, right? It is also the clan system. It is also the way that Indigenous community, how they identify as well. And we see some of that too in Kim Tallbear's work, looking at the issue of blood quantum. Blood quantum is a justification to take away land from Indigenous people because they are, say, too white or too black. They're no longer Indigenous. So thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. And Katie, who's just stepping out, thank you so much for your note speaking about the importance of acknowledging that, yes, our Indigenous peoples, that we are here and we need to all be visible. So thank you so much for that message, without question. The last question I'll share for you, Hugh, and I think this is a pretty cool way maybe to wrap up our conversation. And it's, are there any reading lists or maybe some notable authors and other scholars that maybe you'd like to highlight here for those who are in attendance to want to learn more. Again, thank you for the question. Hugh, I know you and I are both big fans of our dear friend up at SUNY ESF, Dr. Robin Kimmer, and some of her work with breeding sweetgrass. But if there's others, I think this is a nice way to wrap up our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I got my big list in my brain. When I hear that question, I'm like, oh my God, there's so many. But yeah, I mean, I would say, Stephanie Waterman has to me been a really great mentor. Anything by Oren Lyons is really good. If you want to talk about John Mohawk, he's really the most sort of this, Haudenosaunee intellectual we all kind of cite. Brian Brayboy, who I mentioned before, does a really good, lot of good work in Indigenous education. So again, he's worth looking into. Sandy Grande, who's like, again, somebody who wrote Red Pedagogy. She is sort of like the one, like she's like the bomb. So looking at her stuff. Kim Tallbeyer, who I just mentioned, native DNA type stuff. And we have, I can send along to a list if that would be appropriate too. So there's some off the top of my head. Appreciate the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. And we have one more question. And considering some of the conversations that we've had earlier today, and your reference to Halloween and some of the cultural appropriation that might live there, I think this is a really timely question. So Julie, thank you for advancing it. And it comes from this athletic space, which I know is an identity, Hugh, that you and I also share. And the question is as follows. My daughter's school mascot is an Indian. How can I encourage our school district to change the mascot to a more appropriate mascot? How do we suggest bridging this subject in a productive way? And I know that this is an active conversation, not just here in our community in the Lehigh Valley, but really across the country. So any thoughts you may have to that topic, Hugh, would be great.
Absolutely. Hey, really great question, by the way. Who said this? Who asked this one again?
It would be Julie, one of our colleagues here at DeSales. Thank you, Julie.
Hey, Julie. So I would say this. First and foremost, I think, approaching the board of whatever education district it is from, that would be sort of an important, one of the most important first steps. Identifying any Indigenous communities in the area would be really helpful. Identifying folks who have been in the role of facilitator and consultant. I do a lot of consulting work. I think, many of us do a lot of consulting work on the side. And some of the really cool things that we do is to facilitate conversation between different actors at different institutions, schools, whatever. So if people, maybe the school leaders really don't understand the implications here, and maybe I think most of the time they do, to encourage a conversation and to encourage movement, even from the students as well. So, looking at different parts of the community, you have parents, you have students, you have staff, you have faculty and leadership, right? Engaging all those folks together in a conversation would be really good, a good first start. And then kind of putting that onto the board, the responsibility of the board, whatever school it is. And just having the conversation, I think, is just paramount. Bringing it up, I think sometimes people don't really always like, oh, I don't know, but yeah, just bringing it up. And I thank you for bringing that up in this discussion.
A really great question. Thank you, Julie. And again, a very timely one. Hugh, thank you so much. I know personally, I'm so glad that we're able to bring your scholarship, your research, your experience here to the Lehigh Valley. Of course, it's virtually today. But again, to really have a genuine, authentic conversation in honoring Indigenous Peoples Day. And for us at DeSales, this is our second annual DeSales Indigenous Peoples Day lecture. So I'm glad you're able to be a part of this and to also honor the complexities of this conversation, right? And to hold some space and some grace to process, to understand, to know better so we can do better. Thank you to our attendees. I think we were at 30 some attendees, which is pretty notable considering our students don't have class today. So it's great to see the numbers of faculty, staff, a couple students, and some community members here this afternoon. I do want to note that we have additional workshops and seminars the rest of the semester. So please, attendees, feel free to visit our website to register, and that this session will be on our DeSales DEI YouTube channel if you'd like to be able to view it later, and especially with some of the resources that were shared today. Hugh, thank you again for the discussion. Our attendees, please extend a virtual warm thank you to Hugh in the chat. And thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone.